Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session. I'm going to introduce myself for those that haven't come along to one of our sessions before. I'm Manveen. I'm the L&D manager here at the MGAA, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our session today about the PRA climate risk and things that you need to know. Before I start, I'm just going to run through a couple of housekeeping points. You'll notice that you don't have the option to turn your microphone and camera on just yet. Rest assured, you will have access to this during the Q&A. We'll enable them, but we've got them turned off just so that we're not competing with bandwidth and minimising as much disruption to the session as possible. We also ask that you don't use AI note-taking tools. We don't have permission of everyone attending for these to be used, so that if any have come through, I will need to remove them from the meeting. We do encourage actually that you ask questions, and we ask that they're added to the chat, but we will look to cover them mainly in the Q&A at the end of the session. So if something comes to mind, either save it for the end or pop it in the chat and we'll come back to that. These sessions are being recorded, and a link to the recording will be issued to you post-session, again with our feedback survey included, but we'll also drop it into the chat at the end. Should take no longer than a few minutes. And if you find that this supports your learning needs, you can utilise this on your CPD log. You can add the time on. So that's all from me. I'm now going to introduce today's session and hand over to our presenters, Abe and Aidan, to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Manveen, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session today on the Bank of England PRA Supervisory Statement 525 on climate risk, looking at what it expects and what needs to be done by regulated entities in the very short term. First, a little introduction to us. I'm Aidan Thompson. I'm a partner at Weightmans, a lawyer with a long history of advising the insurance sector on environmental matters, liability matters for a long time, but increasingly now on sustainability and climate risk matters. And I'm joined by my colleague Abe Srivastava, also a partner at Weightmans. Abe's not a lawyer, he's an ESG consultant. He heads up all things ESG at our firm, both internally for our own performance and externally too, helping our clients to manage their affairs in a way that gives the appropriate weight to environmental and social issues. I'm going to kick things off with the backdrop to SS5 25 and then a description of its key expectations, both immediate and then in the longer term. Then Abe is going to look at a number of points around competency management and good governance, looking at how teams can become equipped with the right skills and knowledge to meet expectations set out in 525, and how the governance structures can be updated to enshrine climate risk. As Manveen said, there is time for questions at the end, so please do get them ready. So now on to my introductory comments. We really wanted to do something on SS525 because it's such an important stepping stone or staging point for PRA regulated entities, like so many of our clients, as they start or continue to address climate risk effectively. And there's a timeline on it too, as I will describe later. So it has to be taken very seriously across regulated organisations, large and small. Now, there are strong voices out there who say that climate is an overblown topic deserving of less attention. But for most companies, including insurers, whatever these people say, climate risk considerations affect their business directly or indirectly. And when you strip away everything that is taking the headlines at the moment, and there is a lot going on right now, on the sustainability front, things are grinding on. And it's three types of climate risk that we're talking about, that we're concerned about here, that threaten all companies. We're talking about direct risk or physical risk, the risk of adverse weather or changing weather or climate patterns, on operations. And then transition risk, the risk to companies that comes with the wholesale changes that accompany the move towards net zero and other more sustainable platforms. And lastly, litigation risk, the risk of being sued for emissions of the past or for eroding stakeholder value for not responding properly to climate-related events. Now let's have a look first at direct risk and be reminded of the many, many climate and weather effects that are being experienced right around the world. And here we are already noticing that we're getting too wet in winter and too dry in summer. But many places already have weather problems that they're just not geared up for anymore. And the number of such places, such instances is rising. And whilst an insurer might feel weather and climate proof sitting in its offices here in the City of London, the point is that it relies on a great many other businesses, suppliers of every description, insureds who provide the business's revenue, companies and assets that form the investment portfolio. And each of those will have their own long list of businesses on which they in turn rely. And if one of those suffers, or more likely if a number collectively suffer as a result of a one-off weather event or a slow decline, that could have a material effect on the insurer. Unlikely in many cases, yes, but certainly possible. And this is a risk that has to be understood and monitored at some level. And then we have transition risk. The risk, well, there really is so much going on, with carrots and sticks being used all over the world to transition us onto a more sustainable path. Some people, of course, disapprove that this is happening at all, but there's a lot of transition going on that companies, including insurers, need to heed if they want to stay ahead. Transition is partly driven by laws around things like net zero, with the encouragement of renewables, the hurdles for new fossil fuel development, the renaissance of nuclear, banning of internal combustion engine vehicles, energy efficiency in buildings, etc., etc. The list goes on. And laws around climate mitigation and adaptation, making certain activities off limits in recognition of the inevitable effects of climate change. And around nature and biodiversity, with law pushing for its gradual improvement rather than just accepting its gradual decline. And last but not least, around mandatory reporting on climate risk, forcing companies to state their case for the way they behave in a public forum and letting stakeholders decide. The transition is also partly to do with changes in stakeholder preferences. People, customers, suppliers, shareholders, choosing the most sustainable option, maybe to do the right thing, maybe because they think it will make them look good in front of their own stakeholders, but changes in preference all the same. Transitional risk affects every organisation in the world to some degree. And again, be reminded that whilst an insurer might feel itself to be very safe here in its offices in the City of London, it relies on the good health of a great many other businesses, suppliers, insureds, companies and assets that form the investment portfolio. Each of those will have a long list of businesses on which they in turn rely. And so ask, do we really understand what the impact the transition is having on them and the ability to remain good partners? Are they exposed, and is that a problem? And finally, there's litigation risk that some companies might be sued over climate, and certainly no one wants to be one of these. There are two kinds of litigation risk. The first is liability litigation. A relatively small number of companies with a long fossil fuel history are in the crosshairs here for damage caused by climate and weather that's been contributed to by human activity. But then there is shareholder and stakeholder claims, a much wider threat aimed at companies that have lost value as a result of mismanaging direct and transition risk. The potential for these claims affects a very much wider group of companies. It's important too to mention administrative law claims and the susceptibility of companies to challenges to government decisions made in the company's favour. These types of litigation have, for example, seen off the UK fossil fuel industry. Don't think that insurance companies themselves can't be exposed to these claims directly, especially the shareholder claims, but the main problem, as with other risks, is with the companies on which the insurer relies and on which those companies in turn rely. A huge number of potential companies there. Ask again, do we really understand which are exposed to litigation, and is that a problem? So all of this is very useful background to the emergence of Supervisory Statement 525. It came in back in December to make clear what's expected of insurers and banks by way of considering climate risk. The PRA first set in expectations on the management of climate risk in 2019 with the introduction of Supervisory Statement 319. But 6 years on, banks and insurers are being given greater clarity on the PRA, on what it expects of the firms that it regulates, and there is rather less room to hide. 525 has 182 paragraphs compared to 32 paragraphs in Supervisory Statement 319 that preceded it. Now, SS525 is structured into 7 chapters to reflect the more detailed expectations, and I'll be talking about those in a moment. In basic terms, the PRA expects banks and insurers to apply a 2-step process to manage climate risk. Step 1 is material climate risk identification, assessment, and board sign-off. And step 2 is appropriate risk management response. It really does sound very simple when you put it like that. But what hits home about 525, however, is not the steps themselves, but the approach to them that insurers and banks are expected to take, and the internal infrastructure that the PRA expects them to have in place in order that these steps are properly informed and considered at the proper level. Hopefully you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about here as we go further through this presentation. Make no mistake that whilst 525 stresses that individual companies' responses can be proportionate and that firms should be able to leverage on existing governance structures to satisfy climate risk governance, and that there are long-term benefits to a proper approach to climate risk, it poses significant and ongoing challenge to banks and insurers as a whole in the short to medium term. So looking to the future, you have to get to grips with this supervisory statement and grapple with a lot of new expectations. And I'll be going through those in just a second, by the way. The expectations around enshrining climate risk into governance, about serious climate scenario analysis, about proper data, and about disclosure. It applies across the entire operation of insurers. I think that the PRA accepts that it's going to take some companies longer than others to satisfy the expectations, but it also needs firms to get started and not just sit on it. So firms, whether they're large or small, are expected to conduct an internal review against updated expectations, work out where they're falling short, and develop a plan for identifying any for addressing any identified gaps within 6 months, which means before the 3rd of June 2026, which is only about 6 weeks away. This review will wake insurers and banks up to the fact that the necessary change to match the new expectations isn't going to happen overnight. This is not just about ticking boxes, more about upskilling and enshrining new ways of doing things within the organisation. In the second half of 2026, firms should be prepared to provide evidence evidence of the reviews they've conducted and to demonstrate some sort of meaningful progress against the plans to the PRA, should it ever come to call. The PRA has its own approach to regulation and enforcement against its expected standards, but leaving that to one side, remember what I said earlier about litigation and liability risk. Shareholders will come after management teams that have not steered the ship correctly in the face of climate risk, and showing this will be made much easier for claimants when there's an established set of accepted regulatory expectations that have not been followed. So it pays to crack on. Note that there's no particular get out for small companies below certain financial metrics. Smaller firms are required to meet the detailed expectations, especially where the risks are material to the firm. Now let's take a look at these Supervisory Statement 525 expectations in more detail. Remember, these are the things that you have to measure to current methods and ways of doing things against when you prepare your gap analysis. And the expectations are set out in 7 chapters, the first 3 of which are the meatiest. Governance, Chapter 2, Risk Management, Chapter 3, Climate Scenario Analysis. But also there are chapters of expectations around data, disclosures, and then Chapter 6, Banking Specific Issues, and Chapter 7, Insurance Specific Issues. I'm going to look at things a little bit out of order of the chapter numbers because I think it flows a bit better. And start with the risk management expectations. Step 1, as I said before, is risk identification and assessment. And it needs a very detailed assessment of climate risk and the transmission channels through which they can impact an insurer, for example, via underwriting, but there are others as well. You then decide which combinations are material and then put them onto the risk register. It sounds very simple, but SS525 labours the need for the risk assessment to be rooted in climate scenario analysis. More about that in a while, and how important it is during this process to understand risks arising from different third-party relationships, geographical regions, and industry sectors. It also talks about the need to respond appropriately to data gaps that become obvious where material, and trying to close them up. Risk evaluation and assessment therefore needs to be done with a fine-tooth comb. Then we come to step 2, which is risk measurement and monitoring. You need to have a position or categorization for risk on the risk register, basically to accept, to manage, or to avoid, and have an approach as to how you will action this. For risks you want to avoid, for example, in an insurance cover, you could develop suitable exclusion wording, but for risks you want to manage, you have to develop quantitative metrics and limits that enable you to achieve this. And then you have to make sure that the safeguards you've put in place are being followed across the organisation. Other points on risk management that come out of 525. First of all, you have to develop an appropriate internal climate risk reporting infrastructure. It's fine, of course, to piggyback on other risk reporting infrastructure for that purpose. And risk management has to include an insurer's own operational resilience, business continuity, disaster recovery, and the like. And right the way through this bit on risk management in SS525, the need for automatic periodic review of all stages of the risk management is repeated and repeated. This is not a one-off look at risk, it is constant, and things must be put in place to make it so. Now I want to move to the expectations of 525 on climate scenario analysis. Climate scenario analysis is the bedrock of the risk management process, the anchor to which everything else is tethered. It would be nice if we had historic data to inform climate risk decision making, but it's in pretty short supply. Climate scenario analysis based on future climate predictions is what we have to do here. Take global scenarios describing how the climate is expected to change and how the world transitions to a low carbon economy, and work out what this will mean for the business, and in quite a lot of detail. A huge chunk of 525, 28 paragraphs, are taken up on how the PRA expects climate scenario analysis to be done. And it's not possible to do that justice here today. But one day you might be challenged as to whether you've done it sensibly and followed it all through. So be careful here. Use conceptually sound models and toolkits supported by solid research. Select and match scenarios and time horizons sensibly and follow them through. Fortunately, there are a lot of firms out there that can assist with a climate scenario analysis for individual organizations. And finally, a look at governance and the expectations set out in 525. 525 puts the board at the very heart of climate risk decision making. That is the expectation. Board and subcommittees must have their climate risk responsibilities defined, and the board must have a high-level understanding of the impacts of climate risk on the business model over various time horizons and under different climate scenarios. The board is expected to review and agree the material environmental risks in the risk register periodically, and agree the appetite for those risks periodically too. It has to do these things against the backdrop of climate scenario analysis that I've already discussed. The board really has to be on top and involved in that climate scenario analysis. The board has to understand the risk exposures of outsourcing third-party arrangements and set the appetites and tolerance levels for those. And when climate goals and targets are put forward, as companies often do, saying what they're aiming to achieve, the board has to be able to say how they were put together and how they were expected to be achieved. All of this does require the board to be heavily supported on climate risk, and 525 makes provision for this. Person or persons with an appropriate level of responsibility have to be given the job of identifying, assessing, and managing climate risk. Their feet really need to be held to the fire through the appraisal and reward levers that are available. They're expected to take their responsibilities here very seriously indeed. They must get the information to the board that enables it to consider climate risk in the all-encompassing way that 525 requires. And indeed, executive management as a whole must see that this is done. Now, I've gone through all of the expectations of SS525, but I think I've ticked off, sorry, I've not gone through all of the expectations of 525, but I think I've ticked off the important ones. But I just want to dwell on three more things which pop up constantly right the way through the document. First, there's a constant mention of proportionality in relation to the expectations. All firms, it says that all firms need to assess the impact of climate risk on the business model using climate scenario analysis. So everyone needs to do that. But it's only those that are materially exposed those that are materially exposed need to make the greater investment in monitoring and managing risk. So an element of proportionality there. Smaller materially exposed firms can tailor their response using less sophisticated management tools, but they do have to make a prudent interpretation of the information that they have. If the information is not concise and clear, they have to respond accordingly and behave prudently. All firms are expected to keep pace with the evolution of knowledge and capabilities relating to the measurement and management of climate risks. And finally, formal regulatory disclosures are expected to align with the expectations of 525. So an awful lot of insurers will be making regulatory disclosures. Important to make sure that those tally with the expectations in 525. So back to that gap analysis. It may well be, after hearing what I've just said, that you feel that you are some way short of conducting operations insofar as they relate to climate risk in the manner expected by the PRA. Perhaps your governance needs a bit of an overhaul, or your climate risk identification and management process needs significant fleshing out. You don't need to sort that out immediately, but you do need to do your gap analysis, identifying where you currently fall short and put together some sort of plan for closing the gaps you've identified in meeting the expectations. Get that done by the 3rd of June 2026, because after that you may be asked by the PRA for a gap analysis and the progress you have made on your plan. Help is at hand. Please do get in touch with either Abe or me if you have any questions around next steps under Supervisory Statement 525. Now I want to hand over to Abe with his consultant's hat on to talk practically around two things: upskilling of staff and updating governance. Abe, over to you.
Thank you, Aidan. Thank you, Manveen. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'll be covering two important aspects. Please note that these are not the requirement of gap assessment. They might come in handy when you start developing your action plans, or rather start implementing them. So these, based on our engagement with our client base, are the two starting points or two good considerations to keep on mind. Because we are conscious of the fact that we are already at the end of April, and the way approval processes work in a large number of organizations, that gap assessments or the formal initial assessments are to be taken to excos or board. I'm firmly hoping that most of you have got something in place in form of gap assessment. So please consider the 2 points that I'm going to cover for next steps, or for even a consideration on your gap assessment if you are in the middle of gap assessment processes. So Aidan, if you move on to next slide. Yeah. So as you can see, at the top of pyramid are the disclosures that regulators and your other stakeholders would expect an organization to do as far as climate risk managements are concerned. And to make those disclosures, some actions need to happen. Some interaction between the business model and the climate risk team need to happen. A risk assessment and everything that Aidan mentioned need to take place in form of climate scenario analysis, useful inputs to other business functions to adapt into their business strategy going forward. But in order to do all these things, the point that was briefly mentioned in SS5 25 was around capacity and competency. So the big question that I want to pose to this group is, are we sure that the leaders in our firms who are in scope of the new regulation SS5 25 have good understanding of regulatory expectations and are confident of delivering on climate risk management. Based on our engagements and various sessions that we have done on SS525, I can tell you that this happens to be a work in progress. Aiden, if we go to next slide. So what we have done at Weightmans, we have been advising our clients on developing a competency framework, lead, plan, and apply. Aiden, are you able to move to next slide? So while the next slide would be coming up, I wanted to briefly tell you about the 3-pillar based competency model. Thanks, Aiden. I can see those. So lead, plan, and apply can be applied to a number of roles within your organization. So for example, the board or the senior leadership could have competencies related to lead pillar. Somebody who is in charge of the of driving risk management and compliance could have a combination of two competencies like leadership and planning related competencies. And some of the members in team who are required to apply the requirements or the expectations set down in SS525, and they can have a mix of plan and apply competencies or just the apply competencies. So depending on how an organization is structured, the the combination of lead, plan, and apply competencies can be attributed to certain roles who are in charge of delivering on climate risk considerations. Uh, we have got varied example. So for a large organization, we developed a framework comprising of about 25 competencies spread across lead, plan, and apply. For an insurance client of ours, we are working with competencies that are about 16 or 18 spread across lead, plan, and apply. So depending on how you are structured, you can define lead, plan, and apply related attributes for the competency framework. I've got a small example to show you how it could be done and some tips that I would like to share with this group. So Aiden, if we move to next slide. So an example is leadership related competencies. So if we talk about leadership, as per the expectations set out in SS 525, the regulators expect the senior management function to set the direction of overall climate risk management. They also have put the onus on leadership and board to ensure availability of competent resources and an internal alignment or objective setting as far as climate risk engagement are to be delivered and communicated. Now, once you have defined what do you expect from leadership in your respective organization to deliver, you can look at the competency roadmap or how it should be done. If you go to next slide, Aiden, I've got similar examples of plan and apply. People who are tasked with the planning function or application of climate risk management across your organizations in various departments. So you can create a detailed competency area and competency attributes for the roles you think you are going to engage as part of the climate risk management. What I wanted to highlight on this slide was how you would define your scale. I've seen with a number of organizations, they often define competency on a scale of 0 to 5 or 0 to or 1 to 10. And if you get into details, it's hard to differentiate a 4 and a 5 or a 6 and a 7 or an 8 and a 9. So if you ask the same question to probably same function in different geographies, you are most likely to get different rating based on cultural differences and difference in understanding of what rating scales mean. So whatever rating scale you are going to choose, whether it is 1 to 10, 1 to 5, 0 to 5, please ensure you define how you can differentiate each number mentioned on your competency rating scale. And how do you implement this in practice? That will help you to not only meet expectations described in SS 525, but for your other sustainability related issues and engagement, it could come in handy. If we go to next slide, Aiden, please. So the step one involves creating a map of stakeholders at all levels. So like I said, you need to know what your internal team looked like and who at what level are going to be engaged or are going to be part of the plan. And the next step is assigning them a combination of lead, plan, and apply competencies. There could be roles wherein all three are applicable, particularly if it is about risk, compliance, and sustainability functions. So head of these functions could have a mix of all three competencies as the core expectations to deliver SS525. And based on the competencies you choose, whether it is 18, 25, or uh, whatever number you are able to conclude based on how integrated roles are in your respective organization. The next question is to define a questionnaire on these competencies, which is about how are you basically going to assess these roles on climate related competencies. On the scale, we have a 1 to 10 scale. Uh, in an ideal world, you would want everyone to be a 10 on 10, but we know it's not possible. It's a journey. So you must define what exactly are your intended competency level at each role. So for example, at board level or leadership level, are you happy to have people with 6 out of 10 as an intended competency level for the baseline year? And as you go forward, you can revise the competency levels. It could be 7, it could be 8, depending on what your baseline is and what your engagement plan looks like. So once you have defined an intended competency level, the next step is to have an alignment on the approach. Now, there are various ways with which you can do an assessment. The easiest way that we have seen in multiple organizations is a self-assessment. That once you roll out a questionnaire, you define how your rating scales look like, you brief your audience and roll out a questionnaire. We have also seen organizations doing a bit more detailed assessment of competencies. Uh, we have seen examples of interview-based competency assessment. We have seen examples of hard evidence-based, wherein the SSCs are required to share evidences in which then go on their individual files as far as proof of competency is concerned. So there are multiple ways with which you can go around a competency gap assessment. And once that exercise is done, a baseline is established, and based on your intended competency level, there could be roles who are absolutely meeting the intended competency levels, and there could be some where a work or an action plan needs to be developed and go on to an individual's annual objectives or annual development plans, whatever you may have at your respective organization. So this is something I wanted to share as part of approach to competency enhancements, because we are just starting with the gap assessment of SS525, and the expectations uh, are to implement everything that has been mentioned in SS525. If you go to next slide, there's another good practice or starting point I wanted to share. So Aiden briefly touched upon governance structure. What are the key expectations from SS525 or the regulators per se? As far as oversight, accountability, or developing policies and procedures and ensuring adequate resources are available for complying to SS525 expectations. What we have done with our client is updating the terms of references of their various board committees. And if we go to next slide, please, Aiden. Uh, there are essentially 4 key committees in most organizations. When I say committees, I meant board committees, remuneration committee, audit, risk, and nomination committees. So what we have done with this client, we have updated their terms of reference to ensure that climate risk is formally inducted in the roles and responsibilities of these high-level board committees. We also did a workshop to ensure that everyone understand what the expectations are around climate risk management from various board committees. Just to give you an example, remuneration committee could have KPIs linked to remuneration, and climate-related performance or expectations around climate risk integration in business models. And they can also update their terms of reference to ensure a variable factor around compensation is assigned based on the delivery or some of the gaps that you have identified in the gap assessment. Similarly, audit committee can ensure that the internal audit protocols have climate risk integration, and there's a process to check adequacy of internal audits and the control frameworks that you have in place. The expectation is not to create new frameworks, but where existing internal audit frameworks are available, climate risk must be integrated into those frameworks for internal audit considerations. So, and also for external audit. So whether it is LOD 1, 2, or 3, the expectation are to have climate risk covered at all levels. Similarly, nominations committee can look at overall development and maintenance of competency frameworks that we just covered. They can also look at overall skill set that is required to manage or integrate climate risk and transition planning into the business models. Risk committees can look at integration of climate risk management around physical transition, liability, and reputational channels. They can challenge the exercise that is done, whether it is ambitious enough or whether it meets the purpose of sound climate scenario considerations and risk appetite statement. So that's something risk committees could be tasked with. And as the expectations only grow from regulators and from shareholders, having a formal terms of reference indicating climate risk related responsibilities will definitely come handy for a number of organizations. So on that note, I'll end my presentation and we would love to receive your feedback and questions at this stage.
Thanks, Abe. I'm going to stop sharing my
Can
screen
move to-
now.
So thank you both. We've actually had some questions come in already, and I think predominantly focusing on our audience today, and I suppose their need to kind of understand it. I think we've had a question from both Paul and Keith actually, but it'd be good just to have some focus on the role of the MGA, as these are not necessarily regulated by the PRA in their experience, but there's some link to across the frontiers. I suppose it'd be good just to understand insurers' responsibilities and how you anticipate the implementation of this to impact then MGAs as a result of that. Hopefully I've captured those two questions in enough detail there for both Paul and Keith.
Abe, shall I have a go first? I mean, I would say yes. If you're not regulated by the PRA, then of course this doesn't apply directly to you. But you know, indirectly, you will see that lots of other people are doing exactly the same. Thing. Lots of other people who are regulated by the PRA will be starting to get their, acts in order and starting to behave in a particular way, and there will be a sort of a pressure to try and fall into line. People that you supply, customers, people with whom you are involved will increasingly come to expect a certain type of approach within the sector. So whilst it might not apply to you directly, I would say that indirectly you may well be dragged in and have to start adhering to some of these standards and expectations. I don't know what you think, Abe.
Yeah, I agree, Aidan. And one of the points mentioned in SS525 supervisory statement is around counterparties, value chain, and third parties. So insurers would definitely extend climate risk coverage. Obviously, they're going to first get the house in order, but once that is done, the third parties, the value chain members or the counterparties involved in the insurance value chain would definitely be engaged as part of climate risk engagement. Now, what that looks like in terms of quantum of work, in terms of policy formulation, is yet to be seen, but the direction of travel from regulators is pretty clear as far as uh, climate risk management in insurance and banking businesses are concerned.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone's got any follow-up on that or further questions. I've just dropped a note to let everyone know that the chat is fully open to Q&A, and we've also got the Q&A enabled if anyone wants to ask questions through that. But anything further? Just seeing if we've had anything else come through. I mean, I've had a question that's come in the interim. I think let's answer, let's address that whilst we also wait for members to put. Oh, I've just had one come in from Julia. Actually, let's address that one. But are you able to give an indication of when MGA partners might start to see requirements filter along to them, actually, based on the fact that you said the insurers are looking to get their house in order first, and then possibly, like you said, that further down the chain. So when do you think that might become an issue for MGAs?
Well, I think it really depends on the insurers. Sorry, Abe, but I think it really depends on which insurers you're involved with or associated with. I think the PRA. I think there's an expectation, in particular by the PRA, that these changes that are required aren't going to happen overnight. Some insurers will be well ahead of the game already and be in a good position. Others won't be. Some will find that actually there's rather little that they need to do. Some people will think that there's a lot. So across all insurers, there will be a sort of a gradual move over to compliance, but it could take some insurers rather longer than others. So it really depends, I suppose, on how quickly those insurers start to get their acts in order, and at that point it'll start filtering down. Abe, I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that.
I was about to say that it really depends on insurers, because we have seen insurers at two ends of spectrum. The mature ones who have already got action plans in place, they are going to really use the supervisory statement as a baseline to further drive engagements in their value chain. Whereas on the other end of spectrum, we know insurers who are right now in the middle of the gap assessment, which they said is needed to be done ASAP, given the approval cycles and drafting a formal report on gap assessment is concerned.
You've just had a question come through. I'll read it out just in case it's you need me to. But given the board's central role in implementing the expectations in the SS, do you have a view on whether the gap analysis itself needs full board sign-off separately from step 1, especially given the PRA may request this after the 3rd of June?
Yeah, so I can share some of the examples that we have with our own client base. So while there is no formal expectation to have gap assessment signed off from board, but I can tell you, none of our clients, none of the large organizations is going to put something out for regulators without having a senior leadership committee signing that off, whether it is risk, compliance, or the board themselves. We know, depending on the organization, they want to view any regulatory submission first before it goes out in public domain or to the regulators. So that's the case with approvals on gap analysis. But as far as SS525 is concerned, they want board to keep an oversight on climate risk management, scenario analysis, and a number of other things related to climate risk management. But gap analysis is not what the regulation mentioned as of now.
Fantastic, thank you. I hope that's answered that particular question. I'm just going to circle back to the one that came through directly to me. So it'd be good to just understand from you both, what are some of the risks and consequences if you fail to get to grips and adopt some of the expectations, both as an insurer, but also for our MGA members as well, or MGAs?
Yeah, I can have a go at that first, Abe, if you like. Yes, I mean, I think that there are consequences. The PRA can, of course, it has its own sort of buffet of enforcement tools at its disposal. In particular, one end, writing stern letters, but it could do things like naming and shaming, all the way down to much more sort of serious types of enforcement. If there's still continued non-compliance with the expectations. But I would say that the most important thing to think about is something that I mentioned right at the start, which is that if things go wrong and you find that you do drop the ball on climate risk, and there's a serious impact on the organization, and people do want to bring a claim, bring some sort of claim against those against those in charge, it will be made an awful lot easier for claimants if they are able to sort of say that clear, specific guidance as to how climate risk was supposed to be managed was not followed. Now that's, we're talking about sometime in the future now, but those sorts of claims will be much easier if they can hang their claim on something like this, some specific guidance that's not been followed. Sorry, Abe, I don't know whether you want to add to that.
So I'll go back to some of the discussions we had when SS319 came. So, I mean, there was a similar point around putting climate-related disclosures into existing regulatory submissions. There was a discussion around that if the disclosures are going to have climate-related issues and coverage around risk management, then does that pose the risk of having Section 166 skilled person review in case the regulators find inadequate coverage around the management of risk in their disclosure document? So that's another enforcement power regulators have to trigger the Section 166 review for the insurers.
Fantastic. I hope that's if anyone's got any follow-up, but I can see there's a couple more questions, just mindful of time. I've got 3 come through that I'd be keen to get you to cover these as well. So I'm going to start with Luca's question. When, how, and in which form do you see the impact of the regulation to materialise on the end customers, and specifically on SME customers that buy insurance cover?
Okay, so it's a tricky one, to be honest. And let's say when insurers look at their exposure, and I mean, what SS525 is essentially asking regulators to produce decision useful information from climate risk coverage, and in the process the expectation is to put a price around climate related risk. So we will see those pricing changes or putting a price on climate risk more and more visible in policies, in coverage, in the nature of cover. So that is the direction of travel. But in terms of when, I think again it depends on the sophistication of insurer. Are they ready to put a price on the climate related risk and trickle it down further into their products and engagement with their customers? Or are they still few months or few years away from having a direct impact on end customers as far as policy coverage are concerned? Sorry, I do not have a direct answer on this one, but that's something I'm able to comment. Aidan, I'm not sure if you have anything to add.
Yes, well, I think it's going to just take time for things to filter through. I mean, I think I mentioned that once you've assessed your risks and the things that you're wanting to avoid, the things that you're wanting to manage, you've then got to think of ways, how are we going to avoid them? How are we going to manage them? That involves putting stuff in place, exclusions or all sorts of limits and that sort of thing. It's only once you've done that this will start getting rolled out to the customers, to the insured. So it will come. It's not immediate. It depends how quickly the you know, the regulated entities can crank the handle, do the risk assessments, and come out with what it is they're wanting, you know, to do to manage or avoid certain risks. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Again, just mindful of time. We've got two more questions that have come through. Next is from Daniela. Do you think it is best practice to embed climate risks into existing risk registers to develop on existing business risks, or to create a separate solo climate risk register? To get your thoughts on that.
So, thanks, Manveen, and I can take that one. This is actually the discussion I had with two of my clients, and the best practice is to have an integrated one. It may take a while. It may take a couple of cycles to get an integrated risk register in place, comprising of climate related risk, but I can tell you it is the best practice based on what I've heard from our own clients, based on the review processes, how it works, and how it can trigger actions for other business functions. So having a single risk register consisting of climate related and other business related risk, market related risk, all in one place is definitely a good practice. It ensures that a single point of accountability is set as far as risk management is concerned.
I think it might not be expressly stated. I think 525 does allude to the fact that you can combine the climate risk register with the risk register for other things. So yeah, agree with everything you said there, Abe.
Thank you. And then I think we'll just probably make this our final question from Jessica, who asks, have you had any early insights from clients you work with regarding how they're going to resource implementation of these requirements? I appreciate we may have covered this in different elements, but it'd be good just to get a roundup on that.
So resourcing I will take in two aspects. One is capacity and competency. So capacity is a challenge. I'll not sugarcoat it. Many sustainability team or risk management teams are not of a certain size that can manage everything that comes from SS5 25. So there is certainly scope to review the resourcing requirement. The other part is competency, which again, a number of sustainability and risk professionals in the insurance industry will tell you is a work in progress. There is still a lot that needs to be done as far as improving competencies at various levels is concerned. So gap exists on both front, resourcing, capacity and competency. So yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm just going to make a nod to the question, well, to the note Julie is also included in the chat, but mainly for kind of all our delegates today. Obviously, as the MGA, it'd be good to know, should obviously anyone be happy to disclose whether our MGA members have already started to hear from their capacity providers, obviously without naming names, possible implications. If you did obviously want to reach out to Julie and I, please do, or you know, if you want to reach out to Abby and Aidan, I know they shared their details earlier. But obviously I'm going to look to wrap up there and really thank Abby and Aidan for their time and their insight into 525 today, and also thank you to our members for coming along and listening and engaging in our session today. As always, we welcome your feedback. I've just dropped a link in if you don't mind taking a few minutes. Otherwise, I do hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon. Thank you again to all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Manveen. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.